For this lesson, I have two things on my timeline. I have the picture down here, about to throw that ball, and I have our dressage lady here, the instructor, Dressage 4. What I want to talk about is color and the use of something called a scope. Now, if you work in Final Cut Pro for broadcast, like on television, there are limits to the maximum values on luma and chroma that are allowable. Now, let me give you a definition. In video, luma represents the brightness in an image, the black and white or achromatic portion, and chroma is the color. So if a video program exceeds the limits for broadcast, some really weird things can happen, I want to tell you. Distortions can appear in the form of colors bleeding into one another. The whites and blacks in your program will wash out on you, and believe it or not on this one, the picture signal can actually bleed into the audio and cause an audio distortion. So as you're color correcting in your projects, you can use the scopes to make sure that the luma and chroma levels stay within the parameters referred to as broadcast safe. But even if your project, and I suppose most of them aren't, even if your project is not intended for broadcast, we can use the video scopes as an important part of our workflow. For example, if your monitor doesn't display color accurately, now let me give you one word and you can search for this. Spyder, S-P-Y-D-E-R. A Spyder is an electro-optical device that you attach to your monitor to color correct and give you a standard set of color values. So, as much as technology will allow, what you see is what other people are going to see. If your monitor is not calibrated correctly, how do you know that red is really going to show red for somebody else? So that's not a bad thing to do. But the other thing is, you've been looking at this clip for a long time, and that color cast that you thought it had is just kind of been washed away because you've been staring at this thing for an hour. Scopes can help you find that information. Now, I do something at university occasionally. I'll have a student give me a random video clip and I will correct it without ever looking at the video. But to me, that's more bravado than anything else. You have two areas. You have the ability to see the image and look at the image and decide visually if you like it, and the scopes verify what you see. Use them both. Now let's start and look at the scopes in this lesson. We're not going to change things. We'll do that in the next lesson. If you come up to this little tiny button right here and click, Show Video Scopes is your first option. Go ahead and select that. Now the first one you see here is called the histogram. And you can change from the histogram, the vector scope, or the waveform right up here. Let's look at the histogram. What is it? Well, if you're feeling a little bit of deja vu right now, it's because you use Photoshop a lot, and this is exactly what you would see in Photoshop. The histogram provides statistical analysis of the image. It calculates the total number of pixels in each color or luma level and creates a graph, a chart, an Excel spreadsheet that shows the number of pixels at each percentage of luma or color. Now, each increment on the scale from left to right is a percentage of luma. So from here to here, we go in a sense from black to white, or shadow to highlight. And the height of every one represents how many of each one of the pixels exist in the image. Now, since this is a video, if we scrub our timeline down here, it will change. If you're working in Photoshop, of course, it's not going to change. It's typically a single image, although you can work in video to a certain extent in Photoshop. Now, if I come up here to my settings, I can actually go into, say, RGB overlay. Now, what that shows me is not only where the percentages in luma value are, but exactly where the percentages in terms of the actual colors are. If we go back up here again, we also have something called a parade, which shows you each color. Now, think of it this way. Every color in an image is composed of a primary color of red, green, and blue. And how you mix those colors together determines the colors you see in the image. So with this much red and this much green and this much blue mixed in the proportions that you see produces all the myriad colors that you see over here. Now the shape of the graph, let me go back into, say, luma. The shape of the graph also helps determine the amount of contrast in an image. For example, a low contrast image has a concentrated clump of values near the center of the graph, and a high contrast image has a wider distribution. So it's almost like a doctor looking at an X-ray and saying, well, you've got this problem or you have this problem because I can see it within the X-ray. That's the histogram. Now, if we come back up here again and click, we also have something called the vector scope. Let's look at that. The vector scope shows the distribution of color in your image on this circular scale. But you can also see something here. Color doesn't exist in a vacuum. If one color is too much, you replace it not by just removing the color, but by replacing it with another color. And you can see it right here. The opposite of red, if you go right down, is cyan. The opposite of yellow is blue. Green is magenta. So RGB, CMY. Now what are we looking at here? The vector scope is the saturation of the colors. How saturated, how pure those colors are. Now you'll notice a line right here. See that line? If we come up here, that is the hide skin tone indicator or show. Now what does that do? Most skin tones, even if you're a little bit darker or lighter skinned, fall on that line going in this direction. And you can see we do have a lot of skin tone here, and it is falling correctly in that direction. So the vector scope shows you at a glance the hue and the intensity of the various colors in your image. As a matter of fact, if this were a grayscale image, you wouldn't see anything here. These are the percentages of the saturation values of the colors within the image. Now the last one is called the waveform monitor. Looks a little bit different, doesn't it? There's a reason why I brought this guy in down here. I'm going to show you something. Like the histogram, it is giving me percentages of color information. If I move it, you can see it moves around, so the percentages are there. But watch this. It's reflecting the actual image itself, unlike the histogram that's simply a graph. Now watch this area here, because believe it or not, that's him. And as I move it, see his arm moving? We get precise information in exactly the same position as the image itself on where things are. Now you will notice on the histogram, let's go back there for a second, you have a 0 and you have a 100 right here. And on our image of the lady, we are exceeding that 100 here, going into this area. On the waveform, it's the same thing. You have 100 and we are going above it here. Down here, we're okay. Now, what does that mean? Anything on those two scopes, histogram and the waveform monitor, that exceeds 100 or goes below 0 is clipped off information. It's lost. So one of the things that we try to do, if we can, is move that information, in this case, squeeze it from the top and try to bring it down a bit to get it into that area. Now, to manipulate these things and not just look at them, because that's all we're doing in this lesson, you need something to help you work, and that's called the color boards. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next lesson.